Hello everyone and happy Tuesday once again. So I am continuing with my Christmas time stories, but this one is actually a factual story about the hymn Silent Night. So hear these words. Even though Silent Night has been recorded more than any other song in history, the fact that we know it at all is a miracle. Created out of necessity and performed in a tiny village in a solitary Christmas Eve by two ordinary Austrians and a tiny choir. This incredibly beautiful and simple carol owes its debut to an organ that wouldn't play and a priest who wouldn't hold a Christmas Mass without special music. Later, just weeks into the new year, the beloved carol's march to worldwide popularity was begun by the man who came to fix the faulty instrument. So hear the story. In 1817, 25-year-old Joseph Moore was assigned to the position of assistant priest at St. Nicholas Church in Oberndorf, Austria. A lover of music since his boyhood in Salzburg, Moore was placed in charge of the music used at the small church, and he even wrote poems and song lyrics for special services. A seemingly tireless and giving man, he spent much of his spare time ministering to children from the area's poorest families. In his desire to serve and inspire, if ever a man fulfilled the full description of the word pastor, it was Moore. In 1818, during a particularly cold winter, Moore was making last-minute preparations for a special Christmas Eve Mass, a serve he had been planning for months. Everything from music to message was in place. But as he cleaned and readied the sanctuary, the priest encountered an unfathomable dilemma. St. Nicholas's organ wouldn't play. A frantic Moore struggled with the keys, the stops, the pedals, even crawling behind the console to see if he could find a problem. In spite of his efforts, the organ remained silent, its voice as still as a dark winter's night. Realizing he could do nothing else, the priest paused and prayed for inspiration. He asked God to show him a way to bring music to his congregation on the year's most meaningful day of worship. Moore would find the answer to his prayers from events initiated almost 2 years before St. Nicholas's organ played out. In 1816, while assigned to a church in Mariafar, Moore had written a Christmas poem. The 6 unadorned stanzas were inspired on a winter's walk from his grandfather's home to the church. Though he had shared the words with a few friends, the priest never sought to have the work published, nor attempted to come up with a melody to go with his words. When Moore was transferred to the church in Oberndorf, he had brought the poem along with his few personal possessions. On that same evening, 31-year-old schoolteacher Franz Gruber was struggling to stay warm in his drafty apartment over the schoolhouse. Though he had once studied organ with noted teacher George Hardobler, he now played the instrument only for St. Nicholas's modest services. As he went over notes from one of his lessons, Gruber must have been surprised to hear an instant knock at his door and find Father Moore on the other side. By that time, the priest should have been at the church preparing for services, not making rounds, visiting old friends and colleagues. After a quick Merry Christmas, the obviously agitated priest pulled the teacher to the apartment's small table and signaled for Gruber to sit down beside him. In a distressed tone, Moore explained the problem they had faced. After he convinced Gruber nothing could be done to fix the organ, Moore showed Franz his poem. "Franz," he begged, "can you write music to these words that can be easily learned by our choir without the organ?" "I guess the song will have to be played on a guitar." The priest glanced at the clock on the table and added, "The time is so short." Studying the poem, Gruber nodded his head. The look in his eyes and the smile on the school teacher's face showed that he had felt up to the challenge. Confident again that God somehow had a special plan for this Christmas Eve, Moore raced back across the snow to the church, leaving Gruber alone with his thoughts, a ticking clock, and a prayer for inspiration. A few hours later, the two friends met at St. Nicholas. There, in a candlelit sanctuary, Gruber shared his new music with Moore. The priest approved, and after learning the guitar chords, rushed it to the choir members who were waiting for their scheduled rehearsal. What should have taken weeks was accomplished in hours. In the little time they had, Moore said Gruber taught the choir members the four-part harmonies to the last two lines of each verse. Just after midnight, Moore and Gruber stood in front of the main altar and introduced their simple little song. As they sang, they couldn't have guessed that Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht would be remembered not only the next Christmas in their small village, but almost 200 years later around the world. By the late 1800s, Silent Night had been translated into more than 20 languages and was a vital part of Christmas celebrations all around the world. And by the 20th century, like the celebration of Christmas itself, Silent Night had moved out of the church and into the mainstream. Hear the original language for this beautiful carol. Stille Nacht, heilige Nacht, alles schläft, einsam wacht, nur das traute hochheilige Paar, hol der Knabe im lockigen Haar, schlaf in himmlischer Ruh, schlaf in himmlischer Ruh. Silent night, holy night, all is calm, all is bright, round yon Virgin Mother and Child, holy infant, so tender and mild, sleep in heavenly peace, sleep in heavenly peace. Hope you guys had a Merry Christmas. And next time you hear this carol, remember this story.